Hi, I'm Dr. Julie Beischel, Director of Research at the Windbridge Research Center. And joining me today is Dr. Adam Rizvi. Adam, you and I have known each other for several years, but I'll ask you to introduce yourself and tell people about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here with you, as usual. That's correct. I'm a doctor of medicine, Dr. Adam Rizvi. I am an intensivist, specifically a neurointensivist, meaning I deal with critical illness in relation to the nervous system and the brain. So usually trauma, brain bleeds, strokes, that sort of thing. And what else? I think that's pretty much it. I'm the neuro ICU director at a hospital here in Tucson, so I have some administrative duties as well.
Okay. So working in the ICU, I can only imagine that you're probably with people at the moment that they pass away.
Yes, absolutely. Quite often, actually.
About how many times have you witnessed that transition?
It's funny. I was thinking about that in preparation for this and trying to get a rough estimate and a number. I can be pretty confident it's at least 500-600, and I'd hazard a guess that I've probably gotten past 1,000 at this point.
Wow. Okay. So a lot of experience.
Yeah, but I would say I'm not unique in terms of intensivists having that unique role.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. And then, though the process is different for everyone, are there common aspects that you see pretty regularly?
For the patient or for the provider?
The patient.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that is a long answer. Do you want the short or the long answer?
Let's try and narrow it to the few most common experiences.
Well, if I had to group them, I'd say there's in my line of work, there's the patient who is intubated and comatose, so they're completely unaware of the fact that they're imminently dying or actively dying. And then there's the patient who is alert enough to be aware of their own death. And when they are aware, there's usually a sense of denial to some extent, or a sense of acceptance, and a lot of gray in between. But I find that the entire process, in general, in my experience, in the Western world, there is not a great degree of awareness on the part of the patient and their family about the fact that they are potentially entering a very big stage in their life, which is the transition point.
And based on your experience, what kind of things do you wish that more people knew going into that experience?
I would say it would be so much better in all of my conversations with family members and the patient itself if people would seriously engage in their own mortality as early as possible. It would make the process a lot easier, because I feel like the majority of my time, either with family members or with the patient, him or herself, it's helping them get to the point of accepting the fact that they are going to die, or helping the family members accept the fact that their loved one's going to die. And just getting to that degree, that level of acceptance, is a success for me. It's a huge milestone. But if, between you and me, Julia, if I had my way, I would have everyone enter the hospital already having accepted their own mortality, so that we could go further and take the next step with that process.
Okay. And are there things that you wish more family members knew about what to expect, or?
There's some things not everyone has experienced death, and so there are some basic things that I often tell them, which is, the sounds and the smells and the odd things that happen, changes in breathing patterns, is setting up expectations. I feel like once those things are set in place, they don't get scared, they know what to expect, and there's a certain degree of control with when those expectations are in place, that really helps them focus on the intangible things like processing emotions and making sure there's no regrets. And for those who pray and believe in an afterlife, to allow them to start to engage with those belief systems and to do what they need to do to prepare their loved one or themselves for that next step.
And what do you wish more physicians or other healthcare providers would know about end-of-life experiences?
Oh, boy. Yeah. I wasn't sure how to go about answering this question. I would say if there's one thing that I wish my colleagues would take on is researching the abundance of evidence for a non-physical aspect of life. Researching and acknowledging the data that exists that life indeed does continue. And I think there's enough evidence right now that it is, for me, it is beyond a shadow of a doubt that in fact exists. Now, if hypothetically, Julie, I'll just paint a picture here. If all healthcare providers, this is pie in the sky dreaming here, if all healthcare providers acknowledged that there was a non-physical realm to life, that acknowledged that life continued beyond what we call death, imagine what we could do in helping the patient and their loved ones undergo that process. I mean, we could be tremendous guides for everyone involved.
Yeah, I mean, think about how many books there are, how much training there is for mothers who are about to give birth. What if we had that much training for people about to die? And how much suffering would that prevent?
Exactly. I think of, with the utmost of respect, I think of the word doula, and I think of the word midwifery. But in the context of dying. And I know there are even people who call themselves death doulas. I've heard that term. But I think there is an untapped wisdom in the ancient traditions of the world in that regard that needs to be brought into the healthcare space. Okay.
And your undergraduate degree is in comparative religions, is that right?
It is.
How does that knowledge affect how you practice medicine?
So I took a class that was probably one of the highlights of my degree. It was called Death, Dying, and Beyond. And if somehow this video gets to my religion professor, Paul Muller-Ortega, thank you, Professor. I loved that class because I studied about the death and dying process in the world's spiritual traditions, so much so that I came back and I helped TA it as a professor's assistant and help the students understand that. I have a very relatively in-depth understanding of how the dying process is acknowledged and practiced in multiple religious traditions. And so I found myself really actively practicing depending on the patient's religious preferences as a form of respect for their own belief system.
That's wonderful. So you have a lot of different sort of rituals and things that you know about depending on the person's background. What if every physician had that?
Exactly. And at the very least, like, let's say you have a Catholic who's passing away. I'm not suggesting that other physicians and nurses recite the rosary and say some Hail Marys and Our Fathers. What I'm suggesting is respecting and acknowledging that tradition for the patient. And if there's a family member who wishes to pray, I notice that oftentimes physicians will step out. Sometimes nurses will stay for that, which I love. I almost always stay. I'll hold hands if I need to. I'll just stand and be a presence in the room of compassion, of love and care, and allow whatever form of love needs to take place. And if that's prayer in one tradition or another, so be it. But I think the underlying intent for me is let me be a presence of love for this family and for this patient.
Okay. Let's talk about psi. So I think I'm not speaking out of school here when I say you are very familiar with the evidence for the psi phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. And so how does that knowledge, you've sort of mentioned that a little bit, but how does that knowledge change the way that you practice medicine and go about your daily interactions with patients and families?
Yeah, so this really, we could go very deep in this, but I'll give you a relatively surface level or high level idea of how it has impacted my practice. So as long as I've, since a child, really, I've acknowledged that there is this other domain to life. I'm not a hard scientist by any means. I've had far too many personal experiences that one would call psi to ignore that. And I've actually read the literature and the data, many of them. So like I said, that's not in question for me, or there's no doubt there. How I practice it is, in the dying process, I have had many experiences. You know what? Let me share a story with you, and this will give you an example. Okay. In one of the ICUs on the west side of Tucson that I spent some time in, I had a patient who was actively dying. His family was not there, and I didn't want him to die alone. So I stood in his room, and I actually had my hand on his wrist to feel his pulse on a practical level, just so I could know when he actually died, but also to have some physical contact with the body. And I offered a sense of calm and peace. I really ensured that the space I was in was a loving and peaceful one, so that if any part of him was aware of what was happening, that's what he would feel around him. And I had this interesting experience of feeling him rise or lift up, and behind him to the right, I actually saw a vortex. It was, it's not something that you see with your physical eyes, but such a strong sensation that it's visceral and at once akin to vision, but it's beyond that. And for those of you who are listening who have had similar experiences, that's kind of what I felt. And I actually felt a great light coming from that vortex, and I felt his mind connect with his family members lovingly and release them. And I was touched by that. It was his living family members? His living family members, yes. Okay. I actually had this image of him sort of looking down on them, knowing that they would be okay, and releasing them, and then going through that spinning vortex. And I legitimately felt someone left the room. I felt like there was a leaving. When someone walks out of the room and the door closes, there's a shift that happens in the room. That's what I felt. And in its place was this great levity, a great sense of peace, a calmness and a stillness that just filled the ICU room. And I had this sense of feeling blessed and honored to have been with him at that moment, and to see and feel what I imagine he did in that moment. And that's one among many, many amazing, detailed experiences that I've had with patients who've died, have come close to death, or family members who have been present with their loved one as they transition. Lots of amazing things, but psi plays a role because I feel on that non-physical realm, there's a lot that can be done with anyone who's present. It doesn't even need to be a provider. Literally any human being who's present with another who is making their transition. There can be a service rendered if they are aware.
And during the pandemic, when a lot of people couldn't be with their family member as they passed over, did you see an increase in those kind of things where you felt like people were connecting to people who weren't there?
Yeah, we did our best to have video, audio-visual components so that at least the family member's voice is in the room. But when they were not, and legitimately then there was no one there in the room, myself and the nurses would often don our gowns and our masks, and we would be the presence there. We would hold a patient's hand, and I can't speak on behalf of the nurses, but I would tell the patient that everything is okay, that they're loved, that they're cared for, and that their family is okay. And I don't know, I'm not fully aware of it having helped, but there have been some instances. There's one in particular I remember of a relatively young girl who was passing away of COVID, and the nurse held her hand. And I didn't say very much. I was, being that presence, like I spoke to you of, presence of love. The nurse held her hand and was just gently caressing her forehead and saying, your family loves you and they're going to be okay. They're going to be all right. Mm-hmm. It's your time to go, and you're loved and you're cared for. I was so blown away by the love that nurse expressed, and I felt like that had a huge difference on the girl's ability to let go and to make her transition in a peaceful and sacred way.
So in allopathic healthcare, death is considered a failure, right? Oh no, like this happened, though everybody's going to die. None of us are making out of this alive. So do you think it would bring solace to healthcare providers if there was a practice that they could do when someone passes over that contributed to that being easier for them? Do you think that would be a benefit to healthcare providers? Well, I couldn't stop the death, but at least I made the transition more peaceful.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, for even bringing that up. I do think there is an education that is not yet readily available to providers. We're taught it, in a certain sense, to distance ourselves and to remove ourselves emotionally. And unfortunately, that tendency carries onward through most of our career and through most of our engagements with the patients. But it is possible, in my experience, to connect with a patient and their family very lovingly and support them and be with them fully, and not necessarily get emotionally knocked off balance by it. There is, if you've ever been with someone who is grieving deeply, it is one thing to be there for them quietly, patiently, lovingly, in a very centered manner, and help them through it. It's another to then start to feel their grief and then to get emotionally imbalanced ourselves. Then we're not helping them at all, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. So I think it's that balance of how to be lovingly present with family and patients in their transition that needs to be taught. And one other thing I'd like to add, the physicians need not be religious. They need not necessarily practice any particular faith. I think love is a universal language. And even if as a physician you don't believe that life continues after death, I think it is at the very least a humanistic approach to feel love and kindness for one's patients and their family members at the moment of transition, and to have that expressed from the heart, from our being fully. And it need not be through words, but literally just a presence.
Have you mentioned this to other physicians? Like how are you how do they respond when you bring this sort of thing up about you should do love in your practice?
This has been my entire life, Julie. I will often listen in my conversations with a colleague to get a sense of where they're at in their awareness of the non-physical domain, which is kind of my catch-all term for all things energy and psi and subtle energy and that kind of thing. Different people have different terms for it.
Yeah.
And oftentimes I'll get a sense of where they're at, and I will poke and I'll prod, or I'll drop seeds and or place some bait to see if they'll take it, and they'll dive further in the conversation. That's my prelim engagement with them. And once I have a sense of where they're at, then I'll share with them how I feel. And most often it's met with, well, oh yeah, of course. But there's only been 2, maybe 3 physicians that I've flat out overtly expressed my opinions about the transition of energy, of the mind, the continuation of life, and the role that a physician or a nurse can play in facilitating that in a healthy way for that soul, for that mind, for that entity, for that being.
Okay. I encourage anyone who would like to share this video with anyone who might be interested, but I wanted to point out we also have this pamphlet called End of Life Experiences, What to Expect, and it's through the education page on our website. It's free to download and print if you'd like to share that with anyone. And we'll put a link directly to this pamphlet right in the description of this video. I think we covered a lot of bases, Adam. Is there anything else that you wanted to share about dying, death, or what comes next from a physician's point of view?
Actually, it's a practice that I invite others to take on that I've been doing for quite some time now. And it goes back to what I shared earlier about making sure that we as a culture and society engage with our own mortality. This is actually a practice in many of the world's spiritual traditions, but before I go to bed, I make as if this is my last night and that I will pass on in the next couple of hours. Not in a morbid way, but really in a way to say, if that were true, are there regrets that I have? Are there resentments in my heart and mind that I still harbor? Is there pain, psychological pain that I haven't released yet? And if so, I do so, fully feeling as if I'm going to die, let me not hold on to anything. Let me not hold on to any regrets, resentment, judgments, pain, anger, sorrow. I release all of it. I give it to a higher source. I offer it with love to something beyond me. At the very least, I release it. And then I cultivate love for myself and for my family and for all the world. And that really brings me finally to a place of peace. And I think that's the key, peace. If one's mind and heart is at peace, then if the time to die comes, then we die peacefully. And I think that is very meaningful, to be able to die peacefully. And the reason why I do that is because at some point I will be at that moment. I will acknowledge that I'm about to die. And I would like to go through that process of releasing and healing and forgiving, and then coming to a place of peace, having done so a million times before.
Yeah, if you're practicing it every day, it's like muscle memory. When it actually happens, you'll know exactly what to do, and you'll know how to get to that place where it is a peaceful experience.
Exactly.
Okay. I hope everyone who's listening can do a little bit of that. There's a lot of spiritual traditions and even sort of psychotherapy ways that, the Stoic philosophers encourage people this idea of memento mori, like remember that you're going to die. And it really changes. It's not morbid. It just changes the way that you sort of move through the world. And I think it does. We're all going to die. It's not morbid. It's let's all come to terms with it, and it'll be so much easier when it happens for everybody.
That's right.
All right, Adam, thank you so much for joining me today. And
My pleasure.
Thanks for
having
being part
me.
of this. You're very welcome.